Alrighty, welcome back. In the previous lesson, we got our UI set up for our 4 buttons for the homeworld, the vehicles, starships, and films. In this lesson, what we're going to do is we are going to do some checks to make sure that we actually have data in the properties for homeworld, films, vehicles, and starships. Because if you check out the results of the swappy API calls. So for instance, I have here now people/2, and this returns the results for C3PO. We have here films and array, and that has value, so that's good. Homeworld has a value, so that's good. But you'll see here vehicles and starships are empty arrays. And so what we want to do, let me see if I can pull up the finished app here, is if the character does not have any of those values, so for instance, if we got C3PO for the random, and he doesn't have any vehicles or starships characters, we want to disable the starship button. If there aren't any vehicles, then we disable the vehicles button. If it doesn't have homeworld or films, then we disable those, all right? And you'll see here that we also have kind of a nice fade in and out animation going on. And so we're gonna work on that in this lesson. All right, so the first thing I want to do is extract some of this logic here that we have going on into a function. So I'm going to say func setup view, and we're going to pass into this function a person of type person. And I'm just going to take all of this right here, cut it, and paste it right here. And then I'm going to call setup view and pass in the person. But then we'll need to add self to our setup view. And then we can get rid of all of these selfs right here. So click right here after the self dot. And then I'm going to show you a cool new trick with Xcode 10. We have multi-cursor editing. So hold Control and Shift and then click here, 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 and here. And now you can see that we can, we can do multi-cursor editing. Very cool. And then click Escape. How cool is that? All right, so we have our setup view now in its own function. And then what we're going to do here is we are going to do some checks to see if our homeworld vehicle URLs, starship URLs, and film URLs are empty. And if they are, we are going to disable the button. And when we start up the app, let's go ahead and also start those up disabled. So I'm going to select these 4 buttons, come to its attributes inspector, and uncheck enabled. Okay, so they're going to start out disabled when we start up the app. And then in the setup view, we will decide whether to enable them. All right, so how we're going to do that is we are going to look at the person dot, for instance, homeworld URL and see if it is empty. And if it is, we are going to disable it. All right, so first I'm going to go ahead and show you the beginner way of writing this out. So you might think that you would do something like if person dot homeworld URL dot is empty, then we say homeworld button dot is enabled is equal to false, else homeworld button dot is enabled is equal to true. And then you would do that for each of the buttons. If person dot vehicle URLs dot is empty, so if there are no vehicle URLs, meaning that character doesn't have any associated vehicles, then we would say vehicles button dot is enabled is equal to false, else vehicles button dot is enabled is equal to true. And that would work just fine, but there is a much easier way to do this. What we can do is we can set the dot is enabled property directly using the output of this right here, okay? So this outputs a Boolean, true or false. And so if we want it to set dot is enabled correctly, all we have to do is put the opposite of this right here, okay? So if vehicle URLs is empty, this would evaluate to true. However, if it's empty, we want to set isEnabled equal to false. And that's why we have the exclamation point here, which will switch the Boolean from true to false. And then conversely, if it is not empty, if this is not empty, this will evaluate to false, but we want isEnabled to be true, which is again why we have the opposite right here. All right, so we go from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines of code down to 1. All right, so let's illustrate that one more time with the films button. Films button dot isEnabled is equal to not person dot films URLs dot is empty. And then we can go ahead and redo these here. We can say vehicles button dot isEnabled is equal to not person dot vehicle URLs dot is empty, and then the first one again, home world button dot isEnabled is equal to not person dot home world URL dot is empty. And then we can get rid of these right here, and let's go ahead and check this out. All right, so we start up and these are all disabled as expected. We press random and hey, here we go. We got one that has all 4. We got planet, vehicles, starships, and films. If we click random again, then we'll get one. Looks like we have one that doesn't have vehicles or starships. So it looks like this is working as expected. Very good. Now, how about that nice fade in and out? Let's go ahead and check out how to do that, shall we? Now, again, we could do something right here for each and every button, but a better way would be to write that code once in a subclass and just apply that subclass to each of these buttons. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go up here to our view, and I'm going to right click and say new file. And we are going to go ahead and say Swift file and next. And this is going to be called FadeEnabledButton. Okay, I'm going to say create. And then let's go ahead and come in here and we are going to import UIKit and we are going to subclass a button. So I'm going to say class FadeEnabledButton of type UI button, or we are subclassing UI button. And if you recall back to our classes, and we have what are called property observers, right? And we can also override the properties of our parent. So we are going to override the isEnabled variables. So override var isEnabled, which is a Boolean. And then we are going to set a didSet property observer. So in other words, any class that is of this type, FadeEnabledButton, whenever the isEnabled property is set, which is what we're doing here in select person VC, we are changing the isEnabled property, then we can do something here in didSet. Okay, and what we want to do is we want to say if it is enabled, then we are going to fade it in. If it's disabled, we are going to fade it out. So we can say if isEnabled is equal to true, and we actually don't need the is equal part. That is implicitly understood by saying if isEnabled. Then we are going to say self.alpha is equal to 1.0, else self.alpha is equal to 0.5, okay? So we'll make it half transparent. All right, so let's go ahead and test that out. Oh, and it's not going to work though because I forgot to set those buttons to this FadeEnabledButton class. So come into the storyboard and select all 4 of these buttons. Go to their identity inspector and change the class to FadeEnabledButton. Very good. Just make sure that that actually worked for all 4, and it did. Good. All right, so let's run that again and press random. And let's see if we can get one with ships or starships. Oh, there we go. All right. And then they become half opacity. Very good. All right, so that's good, but we want that fade, right? We want that little animation. And so that's actually really easy to do. There is a method called UIView dot animate. And we have here animate with duration, and then you can provide some animations. And it says here that you can animate changes to one or more views using the specified duration. And we are going to go with a time duration of 0.2 seconds. And then you tab over and press enter. And here in the closure, we provide the action that we want to animate. And we are just going to move our self.alpha equals 1.0 into here. And with properties that are animatable, such as alpha, you can do this very easily, and it will automatically provide that animation for you. Okay, so I'm going to copy this and paste it here as well. Only here we are going to change it to 0.5. All right, I'm going to save that and run it, and let's test that out. All right, press random. And it looks like it's working. Ah, yeah, look at that nice fade in and out. Very good. And also when they are enabled, you can click on them. When they are not enabled, you cannot click on them, okay? So that is working out perfectly. All right, and so just to recap how this is working, we subclassed UI button, we override its isEnabled property, and we put in a property observer. That means that anytime the isEnabled property is set for an object that is of this type, which we set all of our buttons to, anytime we set the .isEnabled property, we then can monitor that and do something. In which case we are saying if it's enabled, we do a little animation to fade it to a alpha of 1.0. And if it is being disabled, then we fade it to an alpha of 0.5 with this very simple UI view animation. All right, so that's all we're going to do in this lesson. Some pretty cool stuff. We learned about how to more efficiently deal with if-else statements. And then we learned how to subclass a UI button and give it a animation for when it is enabled and disabled. All right, so in the next lesson, we're going to start adding in our new view controllers. So I'll see you there.